I really want to know is how would you compare those countries to Vietnam?
Vietnam is a beautiful country. I think most of the differences tend to be cultural.
I've seen people complain Vietnam's becoming too westernized.
They're taking some of the best things of different cultures in different countries and trying to bring it back to Vietnam. It's not so clear-cut in the sense of, is Vietnam becoming more westernized? It's definitely becoming more modern, but I still think it's retaining aspects of its cultural heritage.
Welcome to another episode of a Vietnam podcast with me, your host, Niall Mackay. I first came to Vietnam in 2015 for a vacation, came back in 2016, and basically never left. I started this podcast back in 2019, initially called a Saigon podcast, to learn more about the people that lived in Saigon, and since then, I now interview people from all over Vietnam and all over the world to share their stories with one thing in common, their connection to Vietnam. In this episode, I'm really excited to talk to my guest today. He has a very different story to nearly every other guest that we've had on this podcast, so I'm really excited to hear about your story. My guest was born in Vietnam but adopted by French parents, so he is a French national. He has lived all over the world from Kenya to Botswana, went to boarding school in Switzerland, and then came back to Vietnam in 2017 to help his parents' business. And since then went on to start his own business called ULab, which focuses on training, and he is passionate about AI and learning. I'm excited to interview my guest today, who is Cedric Lakelec. Thank you very much for joining me today. Tell me about your background, because I've never met anyone who has been adopted in Vietnam, but you didn't, by French parents, but you didn't leave Vietnam, but you became French. Is that correct?
That's correct. So, yeah, let's wind back 31 years ago or so. Essentially, yeah, I was adopted by a loving French family who I was very fortunate to meet. And basically, right after I was adopted, essentially, I was very young. I was less than one. And then essentially, they took me to where they were living, which was in London at the time. And essentially, then I followed with them all around the world. And so after London, I had the privilege of growing up on the African continent. So at the time, my father was working for a large bank and he was in charge of the African continent, which is why we were moving around a lot. And so we lived in Kenya, Botswana, Ivory Coast, until eventually we moved to Thailand because my family, for many reasons, wanted something a bit different after living in Africa for 5 to 7 years. That's how they made their way over to Asia. And then eventually I went to boarding school in Switzerland, as you mentioned before. Then after that, I went to college in the US. And then after graduating, I worked a little bit for a couple companies abroad. And then I eventually made my way back to Vietnam.
I have so many questions. First of all, you dropped it so casually. Oh, my dad was head of the African continent. That's incredible to be in charge of a whole continent.
Sure. I mean, to the extent that I was a baby, so I had nothing to do with any of that. So kudos to him for doing a good job. But I think even though I think he had a good position, he had the entrepreneurial itch all his life. And so that's why eventually when he went to Thailand, he decided to start his own business.
I would be impressed if somebody was like a branch manager, never mind in charge of an entire continent, but that's amazing. So let's go all the way back then. How much do you know about what led to your adoption?
So let's wind back a little bit as well. So the reason why my family has ties to Vietnam is because my grandfather was a surgeon general, and after he retired, he would do a lot of humanitarian trips. And he would specifically come to countries like Vietnam to provide medical care and support to people. There was already some relationship between our family and Vietnam back in the day. And then essentially, the reason why we ultimately ended up in Vietnam is because my family ended up doing a bunch of these different businesses in education, and Vietnam so happened to be a very attractive market in general. And then, but as for my dad, yeah, they've done a great job. They didn't come from my grandfather was a surgeon general, but he had worked very hard. He was one of 6 or 7 siblings growing up in Brittany in the north of France, which is not very rich. And my family also worked very, very hard for their careers, and I'm very grateful for everything they've been able to offer me today. So coming back to the second part, which is the adoption part. So my parents were always very transparent from the very beginning. They told me your biological parents couldn't take care of you, unfortunately. And so we were very fortunate to be able to have you in our lives. And so they came to an orphanage here in Vietnam where you don't really choose your kid, so to speak. They give you me in this case. And yeah, and that's really just how it happened. And then my parents had always wanted to have children, but they also saw that in the world in general, there are already a lot of kids. Do we really need to make more kids when there are already a lot of kids that need love and care? So their view was like, hey, let's just adopt. And so it was me. And then a couple of years later, they came back also for my sister.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. No, we're not related by blood.
Yeah, yeah.
But actually, people say we look very much alike, which, yeah.
That's just racist.
Possibly. Just Asians.
No, that's so beautiful. One of the first guests ever on this podcast, and is still a good friend to this day, is my friend Sandy. And he was adopted. Sandy, you're going to kill me if I get this wrong. I think it was Honduras. I'm pretty sure he's from Honduras. Adopted by a family in the US, and had so grateful and so transparent as well, and so happy with his life and loves his parents so much. On the flip side, we've also had a guest that is one of the most memorable guests we've had on this podcast, was Suzanne T. Hien Hook, which you can Google her story or go back, please, and find her episode. I mention it a lot. She was abandoned under a bush here in Vietnam. Her parents she's Black and Asian. She assumes her father was a GI, her mother was Vietnamese, and she was adopted by a family in the UK to much fanfare. It was even in the media, and it turned out to be a hellish childhood, and her parents were horrible, horrible people. So I don't mean to bring the tenor down. I'm just saying it's amazing to hear, because I think 99% of adoption stories that I've heard all turned out to be beautiful, and the parents were very loving. And it's unfortunate on that one occasion, or not one, but one of a few occasions, it was poor. But it's so good to hear that you were given that upbringing. In terms of transparency, have you ever tried to find your biological parents or reach out to them?
I think there's always an essence of curiosity to a certain degree. But at the same time, I think my view is that some things are best left as they are. And it's also, I think, quite personal in the sense of things happen the way they are and they turned out great. So I think it's okay. We don't need to always necessarily turn stones, so to speak.
So we know somebody here who has a French father, Vietnamese mother, registered as a French citizen, have lived in Vietnam their entire life, apart from vacations, have a French passport, and because of that, they have to get a visa to live in Vietnam, even though they were born here and have never left, which blows my mind that the visa immigration system here is a little bit like that. Have you had any challenges like that?
I wouldn't say they're as bad as that. So when I was adopted, technically I had a Vietnamese passport, but that passport has since expired, since obviously that was when I was a baby. So ever since I've been here, I've been on a normal work permit, resident card, just like everybody else. So no special treatment, but have not encountered those types of issues.
Yeah,
fortunately.
So do you have dual citizenship? Are you a Vietnamese citizen?
So it's interesting because Vietnam, technically, if you are adopted, will always recognize you as a Vietnamese citizen to a certain degree. But I personally do not really identify myself as Vietnamese per se. I'm more of a banana, so to speak.
I've heard this phrase, what is it? Yellow on the outside, white on the inside?
Correct.
Oh my goodness, it's so terrible. I heard that, I learned that on the podcast a few years ago. I was like, wait, what? Yeah.
No. So no major issues as far as my life is concerned, other than the normal paperwork and admin.
And what about locals' reaction when they meet you? It's a different way to explain it, because there's a lot of VQs come back. And it's not surprising if they don't speak Vietnamese. I don't know if you do speak Vietnamese. Do you explain your story, or what's the reaction when you encounter locals and they ask you about your background or where are you from?
Sure. So it's a bit of a weird situation in that when I'm here, they don't really think of me as Vietnamese. Okay, they see like I look Asian and so on, and they're like, "Oh, you look Vietnamese." But as soon as I open my mouth, they're like, "Okay, no, something is off." And it's the same thing when I go to France. I speak good French. I'm fluent. And then you'd have French people go, "Oh, you speak really good French." And I'm just like, "Thank you." So it's a weird situation that I always feel like I'm a little bit like an other wherever I go. And yeah, because basically if I come to Vietnam, they see me as appearance-wise looking Vietnamese, but I don't dress and I don't think I really look that Vietnamese in that sense. And so they get confused, I think, is more what happens. So they're like, and they don't understand that they think that if you're French, you should be living in France. They don't understand the concept of being from somewhere but living in another place. And it's not their fault for the most part. A lot of folks, not just in Vietnam, have never lived abroad. I don't blame them for it, but that's just so happens to be the kind of interactions that I have.
Well, you described yourself to me as a third culture kid, which I learned that phrase through this podcast. What does that mean to you, being a third culture kid?
So I think it goes with what I just meant, similar to what I just mentioned, meaning that it sounds very cheesy, but you're kind of a citizen of the world in that basically home is wherever people that you care about are at the end of the day. So it's no real clear boundaries in terms of your identity, in terms of where you're from, but more so that you embrace having grown up a bit all over and that you've been exposed to different cultures and different peoples, and that essentially, you don't really see countries or colors or whatever. You just see people in a way. So I think that's that for me at least. That's how I interpret that.
Now, you mentioned about when people encounter you and they know you're Asian, as you said. It reminded me of one of my favorite comedians here in Saigon, Matt Tran, who's been on the podcast before. And he made a really funny joke about how you can basically be interpreted for any type of Asian. What are the mistakes that some people have assumed that you're maybe from another country? And he even made a really funny joke about how you could be even some people have confused him for Mexican because he's from the States. And yeah, have you had encounters like that?
Yeah, for sure, for sure. I like to joke with my girlfriend that pretty much any Asian country that I am in at the time tends to be wherever people think that I am from. I've been called Singaporean, Thai, Filipino. It's the broad spectrum of Southeast Asian countries. Yeah, I maybe less, not so much Japanese, maybe in Korean, but all the other countries, yes.
This is I've just remembered, as you said, that's pretty much whichever Asian country you're in at the time, people will assume that you're from there. And you have obviously quite an American neutral accent of the world as well, which will throw people off. One of my favorites is, we lived in New Zealand before, and there's a very famous actor from New Zealand, and I'm going to butcher his name. He's a Maori, so dark-skinned, and you look at his bio on IMDb, he has played literally, and he's talked about it, he's literally played every single race that you can think of that would come under brown skin. He's been in The Mandalorian, he's been in the Star Wars movies, a whole bunch of massive movies, and you can go through his database, his IMDb, and it's quite funny, and he jokes about it that.
No, I know who you're referring to. I also don't remember his name, but I know who you're referring to. But yes, he's a chameleon for sure.
Yeah, and I absolutely love that. So you've lived all over the world. What is your favorite country to live in, and what is it like living in some of these countries, especially in Africa?
So I was actually asked this in another podcast as well, and my answer is really that I don't have a favorite country, and I think it's because, I don't know if it's because I'm fortunate to have grown up in multiple countries, but you see the charm in many places, and you realize that no country is perfect anyways. Vietnam, people are lovely, cost of living, very affordable, everywhere has its kind of perks and benefits. Obviously, every place also has its downsides, but for the most part, I tend to look at the glass half full whenever I'm in a certain place. So, you go to Singapore, many people say, oh, it's very boring. It's not a very fun country. And to a certain extent, maybe not, but it is very well organized. It's well structured, very safe. So it also really depends what you are looking for at the stage of your life when you are in the place. So I came to Vietnam when I was, so I've been here around 8 years now. So I've been here basically since I was 23. And it's great when you're young, actually, Vietnam. It's a lot of fun. But even now, as I'm getting slightly older, not that I'm getting very old, but I still think it's a good place to live in terms of like value for money, in terms of safety, infrastructure is slowly getting there. Everywhere has its perks. Now going back to the previous part of your question, how was it like growing up in Africa? I was the only Asian looking kid in schools with mainly black children. So that was interesting. But for the most part, no, I had great memories living in the African continent. The nice thing was that instead of going out on a motorcycle on the weekends when we were bored, our family would go on safaris. We'd take the car, go into the national parks and enjoy nature. So that was nice. But I will say the caveat to that was that the reason why we ended up leaving Africa was because there was a military coup in Ivory Coast when we were there. And basically, we found like bullet casings in our garden and stuff like that. And so our parents were like, yep, you know what? I think it's time to leave. So that's why we made our way to Asia.
It almost sounds like a cliche. We had to leave Africa because there was a military coup. But yeah, I can imagine it was very accurate. That was a great answer to a terrible question. I should never ask a question, what's your favorite? It's so black and white and it's not. And your answer was perfect. What I guess I really want to know is how would you compare those countries to Vietnam?
So I think most of the differences tend to be cultural. So I've lived in Thailand as well. And the Thais have a very different philosophy of life. So, for example, the Vietnamese tend to be more Confucian in the sense of they're more similar maybe to the Chinese or the Singaporean, which makes sense. They have a long history together. And so I actually find the Vietnamese, for example, a lot more hardworking than the Thais. Not to say that there aren't Thais who work hard, but I think the Thais are similar to the French or the Spanish in that they like to really enjoy life. And so work is kind of like they don't live to work, they work to live. Versus in Vietnam, it's a little bit of the opposite. So people work very hard in order to live good lives. So I think every country has its own culture and identity. And so, Europe also very different. Although with my friends, we like to say that Europe is a beautiful museum these days, more than anything else. And then in Africa, people also tend to be very, very lovely, very friendly. When I was there, obviously infrastructure wasn't quite where it is today, but when people think of the African continent, they tend to group it all together under one kind of umbrella. But you go to different countries, some of them are extremely well developed these days. I'm not saying all of them, but it's not what the kind of media paints it out to be. Yeah.
I do a quiz night every Tuesday, and we had a quiz question this week, and I want to know your answer. If you know the answer, how many countries are there in the African continent?
I actually do not know the answer to that. That's I can, if we did a mini quiz, if I have to name the countries, I think I'd be much better at that than actually telling you how many there are. So I'm not coming to your pub quiz.
No, really, really interesting what you're saying about the Vietnamese work ethic. Sometimes I think, because I've been here for over 8 years now, things just become so normal. I've lived here for so long. I forget about a lot of things till we have these conversations, and then I'm like, oh yeah, that's right. They work so hard, but it almost feels like they don't mind. Like they enjoy working that hard. Because I look at it, I remember when we first came here, and basically most people have a 6-day work week here. Not every job, but it's very common that they work every day. They work all day. They work long hours. And they have a siesta of sorts, right? And a lot of jobs, they have a 2-hour lunch because they'll have their lunch and then they'll have a nap, which is amazing. But they work so, so hard, but it doesn't feel like it because, and I might be wrong, I'm very aware that I live this sheltered expat life. I'm not embedded in the culture here, but I've been doing this podcast for a long time, which has helped me understand the culture. It seems to me that Vietnamese people work hard, but they play hard as well, and they really enjoy life. Is that accurate?
I would say so. I think it's because historically Vietnam has had a history of quote unquote suffering. And so I think they view the key to the way to a better life through hard work. But like you said, I think they really, maybe not all the time, and maybe not when it comes to admin and bureaucracy, but for the most part, I do think they are very well intentioned. They really do try to do their best typically. I've even seen it in my own company where I have some staff who are working past 7:30 p.m. and I'm like, it's dinner time. Please get off Slack. Go get a life, so to speak. So no, they work incredibly hard. I think they're very dedicated. They're very loyal. It depends. Now, in terms of switching jobs, historically, they used to jump around a lot. These days, a bit less. But no, I think so far in terms of the folks that I've had to work with, I think the Vietnamese are it's the best team that I've worked with so far.
And I 100% agree. So I have a small team that helps create this podcast and creates many of the podcasts for the clients that we work with. And recently we had a team meeting. And so my philosophy with all my team is everyone works whenever they want. We don't have set hours. We don't have an office. We have deadlines and we have tasks that are all reasonably achievable. And they just need to achieve those in their own time. As long as they're done, no problem. So we had a team meeting. We have one every week. We had one a couple of weeks ago. And I said to them, look, I've realized that we all work on our own schedules and that's amazing. But I've realized sometimes, myself included, will message like Sunday morning, is that blog post done? And we're all very friendly, so it's not never, is that blog post done? It's more, oh, I've just remembered we need a blog post for today, blah, blah, blah. And I realized that's not cool. I'm from Europe, right? I'm from the West. We need to have boundaries. And I said, should we do it that we can only message each other about work between 8 o'clock and 5:30, Monday to Friday? The rest of the time, we can message each other as friends, but no more work chat. Literally, the whole team went, no, we don't mind. And I was like, wait, what?
No, that's true. That's true. And I think you're right, because they're so used to working hard. I mean, even, you see like high school students, university students, they all have second jobs, or they're doing little things, running little businesses. So they're always very active. But at least as far as my company is concerned, I tell them I really don't try to message anybody past like 6 p.m. on a Friday. And in the worst case, if it's something very important, I will just remind them maybe on a Sunday night that, these are the things that we need to focus on this week, but I don't actually ask them to do anything per se.
Yeah, no, they've gotten good. They know that pretty much not to message me after 5:30 on the weekend, because I realized it was impacting on my life as well, and I had to be like, I want the weekend. And talking about the hard work as well, one of the girls on my team, she's just finishing university. She's going for a full-time job. She's part-time with us, and she's been with us for over a year, as you mentioned about the loyalty. She's just incredible. She's amazing, and I would love nothing more for her to come and work full-time. But she doesn't want that. It's not her career path, and that's fine. So I had a conversation with her recently, and I said, what are your plans? Because I don't want you to leave. And thank God she was like, I want to work with you forever. And I was like, but are you going to be able to do that? Because you're going to get a full-time job. She's like, of course I can. Like, such a stupid question. Of course I can still do this part-time while I have a full-time job.
Yeah, they make it work. They'll arrange their schedule. And actually, I find that actually Vietnamese people wake up very early, typically. They do their normal jobs, quote unquote, and actually, because maybe they might start at 8 a.m. by 5 p.m. they're done. From 4:30, 5 p.m. basically they're like, oh, I have time for a second job. I think for them it's second nature.
So you came back in 2017 to work with your parents' business. What was that business? And that's about the same time that I arrived in Vietnam to live. What was it like coming back after being away?
Sure. So I actually, just tiny correction, I came back in 2016, but no sweat. Basically, the reason why I came back was because I had recently graduated from university, about a year. I'd done some small job. I'd been working in the U.S., from the U.S. rather. And I had the choice to go very traditional university graduate. So they were like, go into consulting, into banking, or you work in big tech. And so I interviewed at PwC. I interviewed at JP Morgan Chase for investment banking and so on. And then the more I went through the process and the more I observed my own peers, the more I realized, hell no. So it basically was, so my father, who was already running his business here in Vietnam, was like, okay, look, I think one day you're most likely going to want to be an entrepreneur as well. Why don't you come to Vietnam and you'll get a bit of experience and learn what it's like to operate and grow a business. And so, most of my peers, when they graduated from university, they were all making whatever, $6,000, $7,000 salaries in these big companies. And here I was going to Vietnam and
Wait, do you mean 6-7 figures?
$6,000-$7,000 salary.
Per
month.
Sorry.
I
I was like per year.
No,
like
per year, that's tiny. Yeah. Although that was what I came to Vietnam getting paid when I get here per year, not per month. But I valued learning and acquiring skills and capabilities and competencies more than just getting a paycheck and being part of just a giant machine. Although there's nothing wrong with that. If some people enjoy that's perfectly fine too. But it was not what I aspired to be or aspired to do. So long story short, basically came to Vietnam, and then so my family's business at the time was a company called Wall Street English, which was basically a language school teaching English and soft skills to adults. And so my family had done that already previously in Thailand, in Indonesia, and Hong Kong. So they were quite seasoned operators. So I thought, okay, this is a good experience for me as well to come to experience that. And so I was in charge of doing different projects. I had a small team, and so we were responsible for a lot of initiatives that revolved around about 6,000-7,000 students.
Your family own Wall Street English?
The franchise, yes.
Wow. So that is a massive English school here in Vietnam, Vietnam-wide, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, so they exited the business in 2017. I haven't kept too much track of how the business has gone since then, but yes, pre 2017, that was us.
So I have one question that I'm so excited to hear your answer. So Wall Street English only in malls, or are they in other places? I've always seen them in malls.
We used to have some centers built like standalone, not in malls. When we exited the business, there were about 6 centers. You are correct, though. 4 of them were in malls, and 2 of them were not. But basically, the reason why they were put in malls, it's a similar concept to going to the cinema fundamentally. So we use the centers as a means for people to come socialize and practice their language skills, not so much to do the academic part. So they could self-study at home if they wanted to, but really a center, we tried to make it more of a warm environment where people would actually want to come and spend time and have fun and meet people and have fun and practice their English, obviously.
Well, that ties into my main question I was excited to ask. One thing I noticed, and it's an obvious tactic to me, was all of those centers in malls had clear glass windows and you could see in, which for most English centers, they're just normal office buildings or whatnot, but all of the Wall Street Englishes had clear glass walls, windows. You could see right in, often see the Western teachers. And I think I know the answer to this, but why was that a tactic? Or was that a tactic, which you're nodding your heads, which I assume it was, and why was that a tactic?
It was a tactic, and I think I take absolutely zero credit. Actually, this is actually more my father's doing. So he was very much into so he was very involved in the design of every single center. So in my family, for some reason, we enjoy interior design and just making stuff. So the main reason being, really, we want people to see what the product is, what the service is like. We don't hide anything. Full transparency. What you see is what you get. And therefore, we held ourselves accountable as well to a certain standard. And so we wanted other people to see that as well. So it was a branding thing. It was an efficacy thing, and really just a positioning thing as well. Because like you said, many centers, very traditional, more office-like kind of structure, but we wanted to build an environment that was a lot more similar to a Google office or a coffee shop in a way than an actual academic place.
And I assume there's a little bit of that as well, that, as I know from being here and working in an English language center, that Vietnamese parents or people who want to study English love seeing foreigners in the center. And so it's a little bit of, here's a big clear glass window. You can see it. So I did language testing for ILA where I worked for many years. So as a tester, so students would come in, I would test their English so we could be placed them appropriately. And at one of the newest centers, the last one I worked at before I stopped last year, that was very similar. So the testing room, and I don't know, I assume it was designed like this, but the testing room was at the front of the building, big glass window so people could see in. Now, on a Saturday morning when I was testing, the way, just coincidentally, the sun shone right into the room. And it wasn't overly hot because we got air conditioning, but you could barely see the laptop screen because the sun is shining in. And I asked repeatedly, can we put a blind in? And eventually I was told no, because they want parents going by to see the English-speaking Westerner testing the kids. I understand it from a marketing point of view, but from a practical point of view, it's like, I need a blind.
Or they could have put like a smoke like window kind of thing to block some UV or something.
And it only really applied to if you're testing at night, it doesn't matter. But it's just this on the weekends in the morning. But I'll forgive them. I get it. So you came back 2016. What have you seen now in 8 years? What's been the big changes that have surprised you in Vietnam and in Saigon?
For sure, a lot, as I'm sure you know as well, right? But I'll give you a ton of buildings. I don't think the building existed when I came here in the very beginning. I think a lot of construction, a lot of infrastructure has been built up. When I came here, it was still mainly motorbikes and motorcycles, but now everybody has a car. Now we have Grab. So the city itself has changed a lot. And I think the way that people live in the city has changed a lot as well. So when I came here, I think there were only like 2-3 cocktail bars. Now I think there's a cocktail bar on every street, everywhere, pretty much. Like we had to look for these cocktail bars. I think, yeah, in all aspects of life, whether it's in business or in leisure, I think the living standards of Vietnamese in the last 8 years have increased significantly. And you can see that also in their behaviors and the way that they comport themselves. So yeah, very interesting. And I think the city is a reflection of that as well.
So at the risk of repeating myself, because I know from even just hearing myself, but I know from feedback I've had as well, I talk about this too much about how much Vietnam and Saigon has changed because it changes so quickly. So I was going to delve a bit deeper into that, and you touched on it at the end. So instead of just infrastructure, how do you think the mentality of people have changed?
Sure. I can see it because I work with a lot of younger folks similar to you. And I do think that their mindset is very different to, let's call it the older generation. I think the younger generation are a lot more environmentally conscious, socially conscious, because a lot of these folks are millennials, Gen Z, Gen Alpha, right? And so I think they value more experiences and being themselves over making money. And they still work hard, but they don't work hard because they want to make money. They work hard because they want to learn or they want to better themselves. And so I think there is that kind of generational shift between the slightly older generation and the current generation. Yeah, in terms of even food, so they go out, they eat a lot more varied diets now. Now they go before they only used to be beer clubs, now they actually go enjoy cocktails, people drink more wine. It's not that they've been more westernized, it's just that now I think they have exposure to more things and a lot of them are traveling more as well. So I think all of that is creating this melting pot of younger folks who just have a slightly different view.
And do you think that is a positive or a negative? Because I know I've seen people complain Vietnam's becoming too westernized. I've seen that comment on one of my videos before when we talked about the development of Vietnam. How they shouldn't become like the West, they should stay themselves. Some people I've noticed, and I fall into it sometimes as well, they fall into this trap of romanticizing the past when Vietnam was slower and the people were different. But then you're like, and they're like, oh, bowl of pho was 10,000 dong. But then you have to remind them when pho was 10,000 dong a bowl, people were so poor, they had no money. Yes, it's becoming more westernized. Yes, they're going to cocktail bars more, but it's because they have more money. Is there a balance, though, or do you think Vietnam will still retain its Vietnamness to make up a word, or become just generic like the rest of the world?
I think the Vietnamese are very proud people and very patriotic in the sense that they definitely value their historical culture, at least from what I've experienced living here. And so I think even though there are aspects of Western culture that are coming here, I really still think that the Vietnamese are quite loyal to their culture. And it's more of an assimilation and a melting pot now of cultures. Not so much that it's being westernized, but more they're taking some of the best things of different cultures in different countries and trying to bring it back to Vietnam. That's why you have a lot of young people who maybe grew up abroad. We call them sea turtles. And so they grew up abroad and now they're coming back to Vietnam because they think that there are a lot of opportunities here and they're bringing all their knowledge and in French we say savoir-faire. So I think it's not so clear cut in the sense of is Vietnam becoming more westernized? I think it's definitely becoming more modern, but I still think it's retaining aspects of its cultural heritage. And I think because the Vietnamese are very proud of their culture, which they can be and should be, then I don't see that as an issue per se. I think for me personally, what I would be more worried about are more things like climate change, pollution, and things like that. And that's not necessarily a Western or a Vietnamese thing. That is just a we should fix this thing.
It's a little bit of a colonial Western viewpoint as well to think that Vietnam is becoming westernized, because from the conversations I have with some Vietnamese people, they want to become more like Singapore and Korea and Japan and or Taiwan. These are not Western countries like at all. Maybe you could argue that those have been westernized, but I don't think so. They're just, as you say, modern. So what do you see for the future of Vietnam in the future? Why did you set up a business here that you must be excited about the future?
Yeah, I mean, well, now it's been 6 years. I'm still excited about the future. Don't get me wrong. I think Vietnam has a choice to make, and it's going to be a very important choice. So right now, they're trying to be a jack of all trades, so to speak. So they're trying to be good at manufacturing, for example. So they took a lot of business from China. They're trying to be good at technology. There's companies like FPT. Vietnam has very good engineers. But it's also trying to attract tourists. It's trying to position itself as an attractive tourist destination. And I think it's sending mixed signals, both for Vietnamese people and to the world in terms of how it wants to position itself as a country. So, if we take the example of Singapore was like, okay, look, we're going to be the Switzerland of Asia. We're going to be a place that's very safe where people can put their money. It's a very black and white definition that's a very simplistic view, but that's how Lee Kuan Yew positioned Singapore. And I think Vietnam is still not very clear yet on its overall vision of where and who it wants, of what it wants to be, essentially. And I think we're seeing that right now, where it's evolving, and also the government is pushing in all these directions. But because there's that lack of kind of clarity and vision, people are a little bit unsure what the future holds. And that's also why a lot of Vietnamese people also still want to leave Vietnam as well. So I think, yeah, they have an important decision. It's not a decision, but they need to think about their positioning very clearly, because you have Thailand next door, which has always been very famous for tourism, and it's infinitely easier to get a visa or to go travel to Thailand than it is in Vietnam, right? So do you really want to compete as a country with a neighbor that basically can offer better services, has a better service mindset, and is just easier to access? Vietnam is a beautiful country. Maybe there's potential for tourism, but is that really where we want to go? That's not really up to me to decide, but those are I think the questions that they should be asking themselves moving forward.
I think that's the first time I've heard that opinion, and it's absolutely perfect. And it's made me think, what does Vietnam stand for as an international country? Who is it trying to attract? Definitely not tourists with the visa system at the moment, that's for sure. Is it manufacturing? Is it tech? And I think there is a really great opportunity, though, for Vietnam to develop one of those, whichever it decides to do. Cedric, thank you so much for coming on a Vietnam podcast. This has been so interesting. I really, really appreciate your time and coming on. Thank you for tuning in to a Vietnam podcast. Just incredible after we started this in 2019 that it's grown and continues to grow as well. So if you enjoy this podcast, please share it with someone else that also is passionate about Vietnam, that wants to learn more about what it's like for me to be an expat here and talk to so many interesting people and share their stories. Don't forget, rate, review, subscribe, do all of those amazing things. It really, really does help. Unless you're going to do less than a 5-star review. If it's less than 5-star, then don't bother. Leave a comment, unless you're that one guy that I highlighted before that just leaves comments telling me to not talk about infrastructure and to do more bar reviews and to be better. I hope this is better for you. I really do. I do appreciate your comments. I'm making fun of you. I made fun of them on the last video. I do actually appreciate that you took the time to watch the video and leave a comment, but don't be so negative, man. And yeah, thank you very much. Remember, if you want to join our Patreon and become a Bop Sao Dare and join the Vietnam podcast community, go to patreon.com/a Vietnam podcast and you can become a Bop Sao Dare and you get episodes like this before anyone else. So thank you very much. Thanks for joining.
Cheers.
Cheers.